Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia Synthx tutorial series. In today's episode, we're going to have a more detailed look at the layering of the synthesizer. We've got these two different copies of the Synthx A and B, how they interact. And we're also going to have a look at the oscillators to figure out how they work. If you enjoy this series, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel so that I can carry on making these videos. Okay then, where we've started today is with the template preset. The template is great because it gives you the simplest possible view of the synthesizer. So if you go down to the template menu and select default, what we get with this default preset is a simple sawtooth on layer A. And we're only hearing layer A at the moment because the mode is marked as solo. We'll have a look at all of this in more detail in a moment. If we jump over to layer B, we hear a pulse wave. You might think it's a square wave, but it's actually a pulse. If you have a look at the output, here's oscillator 1, which is currently turned up, and here is our pulse setting. But because the pulse width is set to 0, it's effectively the same as a square wave, which is the button immediately to the left. Those two buttons are going through very slightly different circuitry, but effectively resulting in the same output. Let's jump back to layer A again and have a look at all of that in a little bit more detail. So we have three separate modes that we can engage in the Synthx, and in solo mode you only ever hear one of the two layers at a given time. It's soloing the layer, not individual oscillators. If I turn a second oscillator up, you can clearly hear those two oscillators, and I detuned one of them to make the difference more apparent. So that's what solo does. It allows you to hear one of the two layers. In duo mode, we're going to hear both layers simultaneously, but we're only editing one of them. Firstly, let's press a key. So that's a combination of the sawtooth from layer A and the pulse wave from layer B, but we're only looking at the controls for layer A, which is the blue side of the synth. If I click layer B, it's going to sound identical, but now we're only editing the second layer, layer B. So duo is what you engage if you want to hear the composite sound. If you're building a preset and you're using two separate layers and you want to compare those two sounds as you're doing your sound construction, then engage duo mode. You can hear everything, but just remember to toggle backwards and forwards between your two layer options. And I've just realized I'm using these controls interchangeably. They are identical, and which one I click is literally wherever the mouse is nearest. So duo for the entire composite sound, solo for your focused individual layer editing, where exactly what you see is what you're getting in your ears. Stereo link is a slightly odd hybrid. This basically simplifies the synthesizer to only output one layer. At the moment it's outputting layer B, but it's generating two copies of it. So it's kind of stolen layer A, if you like, shuffled a copy of layer B over there and then hard panned them left and right. At least that's what the control tells me it's doing. If you have a look at the pop-up help at the bottom of the interface, both layers are hard panned left and right. I have no reason to disbelieve that. The thing that's slightly unusual about this mode though, is that in the pan and volume controls, we actually have independent pan, and it does something. If I press a key and play with the pan settings, that's clearly panning one of these two layers left and right. It's doing something, and what I think it's doing is leaving the other layer alone. Unfortunately, I can't prove that, because if I jump over to layer B, we're going to hear two copies of the pulse wave instead. And there it is. Okay, let's go back to the regular modes, solo and duo. If I head back over into solo, here I am currently on layer B, so we're going to get the pulse wave. Let's import the sawtooth from layer A into layer B. We can accomplish this with the copy buttons. So here we're going to import or copy layer A into layer B, little arrow pointing to the right. Let's press that button. We've just inherited the sawtooth from layer A. Here it is. So we're still on layer B, all of the controls are green, but there's our sawtooth from layer A. In reset mode, we initialize the currently selected layer. So let's just make a few changes and press reset. Everything goes back to its default values, but it is only initializing one of those two layers. So I'll make a quick edit to B, jump over to A, make some changes here, reset A, that's fine. but B is still in its previously edited state. So there's no way to initialize both layers simultaneously apart from using the actual template itself. That's really what the template's there for. And here we are again, sawtooth on A, pulse on B, and duo to play both layers simultaneously. Okay, good stuff. Let's start having a look at these oscillators in more detail. Might as well start off with oscillator 1 because that's the one that's currently engaged. So have a look in the oscilloscope, sawtooth, triangle, square, pulse that looks exactly like square until we change the pulse width. So basically a square wave is a pulse width where the duty cycle, in other words, the control voltage at its maximum, is equal to the length of time that the control voltage is at its minimum. If we change the pulse width, we alter the ratio of the up and the down, the positive and negative. And it's a very common feature of synthesizers to be able to automate your pulse width, and we call that pulse width modulation, or PWM. This synth actually has PWM built into it. It's an intrinsic feature of the synthesizer. We'll have a look at that in a moment. If you double click any of these controls, it resets it back to its default position. So the pulse width goes to 12 o'clock, which is 0, but different controls in the synth will have different initial or default states, and you just have to basically find out what they are. If you want to change a variable control, instead of left clicking, which does exactly what you would expect it to, I'm now going to right click with my mouse and I get much finer control. I'm moving the mouse quite dramatically, but I'm only moving it in 1/100th of a step of the volume in this case, as opposed to a left click, which has a much wider range of control. Similarly with the pitch controls, we default to 8 foot, which is a simple pitch ratio based on organs from yesteryear, but if you switch it to 16 foot, the pitch of the sound will drop by 1 octave. And then transpose allows us to step up in semitones. And fractional divisions thereof. So at the moment we're at 6.8 semitones above the center point of this oscillator. There's no way, unfortunately, to make this control quantize up in absolute semitone steps. The best way to use this control, if you do want to step up in exact semitones, is to get it as close as possible. So let's head for 7. There I am at 6.98, and then switch to right mouse control to head up those extra 2 cents, and there I am at 7. So now when I press a C on the keyboard, you're hearing a G. Double click the control, set it back to 0. Okay then, everything we've looked at so far has been very straightforward. Now it's time to slow down a little bit. So what we're going to look at now is a little bit more complex. We have 3 advanced oscillator controls in this synthesizer. Cross modulation, which in the case of oscillator 1 is labelled oscillator 2 PWM. We have ring mod, and oscillator 2 has its own special setting called hard sync. First of all, let's have a look at PWM. I'm going to engage this button and you'll see that the pulse light went out. So PWM is basically one of the 5 primary oscillator shapes. What's happening here is that we still have a pulse wave, just like we did when we clicked the button to the left of it, but now the width of the pulse that's being output by oscillator 1 is going to be modulated by oscillator 2. Now oscillator 2 is an audio rate oscillator. At the moment, with the key that I'm pressing, it's cycling over 100 times a second. Whatever oscillator 2 is doing, it's going to do that to the width of the pulse on oscillator 1. This is going to result in a very complex tonal output because the sound, the shape of the sound that's being made by oscillator 1 is going to be constantly changing potentially hundreds of times a second. Now, as things stand right now, when I press a key, you hear this oscillating sound whooshing backwards and forwards, and you can see the shape of the wave changing in the oscilloscope. It appears that something quite slow is happening, but that's only because these 2 oscillators are cycling at almost exactly the same rate. Now, this is an analog synthesizer, so nothing in the analog world is absolutely precise. And the very subtle difference in the pitches of these 2 oscillators is what's causing this waving effect. The moment I do anything to the pitch of oscillator 2, the interaction between these 2 oscillators is going to vary wildly. Now you're getting a better idea of just how fast the tone, the shape of the wave in Oscillator 1 is being modulated. There's a really interesting family of sounds with PWM, however, when the pitches of the two oscillators are very close but not identical. You see me, I'm only 0.3 of a semitone away in the two oscillator outputs now. And I'm able to have quite fine control over the shape of these two sounds. The moment I head more than a semitone away in pitch, however, that's when we get the much more dramatic pulse wave modulation, and we end up with quite an industrial sound. The shape of Oscillator 2 still matters as well, so that was a sawtooth, but if we switch over to square wave, get a different tone, because the entire shape, whatever Oscillator 2 is doing, and it's doing it 130 times a second, that entire output is being fed as a control voltage into the pulse width of Oscillator 1. This is what I meant when I said it was quite a complex relationship. Cross modulation like this is quite an involved subject, and there's an awful lot of different sound that you can generate by playing with the settings of the two different oscillators. Let's throw all those changes away. And this time we'll have a look at ring modulation. Now this is another kind of cross modulation, in other words, using one oscillator to affect the other. But this time, instead of modulating the width of a pulse wave, we're actually going to combine the outputs of the two oscillators together. We're literally going to multiply the control voltages of the outputs to produce one cumulative output. So when I engage ring mod on Oscillator 1, we can still only hear a single oscillator, but now whatever Oscillator 2 is doing is going to be combined with Oscillator 1, and we're going to hear the output of those two oscillators simultaneously. Now because we start off with a sawtooth, combining two sawtooths together generates a very complex sound immediately. Both of these oscillators are effectively at their simplest possible positions. And just have a look at the complexity in the output of the oscilloscope. But where ring modulation really comes into its own is when, once again, you vary the pitches between the two oscillators. This is going to generate a very atonal effect, because the actual oscillating output of both of those oscillators is going to be combined together to produce something that's effectively dissonant. So as you can hear, as I increase the pitch of Oscillator 2, the overall tone is kind of going up, but it's going up in a very unpredictable way. If I increase the pitch, if you watch the tuner, it's not going to just rise consistently. G sharp to C to F to C. Oh, there was a B in there as well. There's a complex relationship going on between these two outputs, which generates something called a sum and difference effect. If I reduce Oscillator 2 back to its default pitch, the easiest way to see ring mod in operation is to watch the spectrum analyzer. Every pitch peak, every harmonic, is basically going to split up into three. If you pick on any individual peak, you can see the sum and difference, in other words, a positive offset and a negative offset centered around the central harmonic. Which generates this really enharmonic sound. Don't want to spend too long today talking about ring mod specifically, but one quite nice use case for it is to use perfect fifth intervals between the two oscillators. So if I set Oscillator 2 to 7 semitones, which is a perfect fifth above the fundamental, again, I just switched to right click mode there to get fine control. And I'll use a waveform that's a bit simpler than a sawtooth. Let's switch to square wave for both oscillators. So without ring mod, there's my simple square wave. Now I introduce the perfect fifth ring modulation by engaging ring mod. So both oscillators are in square wave mode. It's a very metallic, clinical sound, but at least we've got some sort of identifiable pitch there, and the tuner agrees with us. C, D, E, F. There we go. So there's one simple example of ring mod in use. Again, throw all those changes away, get back to our default template. And now we're going to switch over to listening to Oscillator 2. So we'll turn the volume of 1 down and 2 up in order to demonstrate hard sync. What's happening when we engage hard sync is that the pitch of Oscillator 2 has now been slaved to Oscillator 1. That might sound like an unusual concept, but it is true. If I press a key down and change the pitch of Oscillator 2, doesn't change the pitch of the output at all. If I change the pitch of Oscillator 1, however, which we can't hear, there's me changing the pitch of Oscillator 2. So why do we sync oscillators together? Well, it's a way of generating waveforms that can't be produced via any other means. Because what's happening is that Oscillator 2 is generating its waveform in whatever shape it's set to. So at the moment it's outputting a sawtooth. Turn hard sync off. There's my sawtooth. If I turn hard sync on with both oscillators at the same pitch, there's no change in output. And here's the secret sauce with hard sync. What happens is that every time Oscillator 1 reaches the end of its waveform, in other words, it's completed one full cycle of output, it issues a reset command to Oscillator 2 to begin drawing its shape again. It doesn't do anything else. Hard sync doesn't accomplish any other purpose. That's all it does. It generates reset signals from Oscillator 1 depending on how quickly it's cycling. The easiest way to demonstrate how hard sync works is to hold a key down, and I'm going to increase the pitch of Oscillator 2. Watch what happens in the oscilloscope. So I've just frozen the oscilloscope so that we can have a look at this output in more detail. What's happening is that Oscillator 2 is drawing its sawtooth wave. It's getting to the end of one cycle, going back to the beginning of a new cycle, beginning drawing its wave, and at this point, because it's cycling faster than Oscillator 1, it receives this magical reset command. So it does that. It jumps back up to the top of the wave and begins drawing again. And so every single one of these little points that you see is the issue of that reset command from Oscillator 1. The faster Oscillator 2 cycles, the further it gets in drawing that second wave before that reset instruction comes along. Now what you need to do is have a look at the total cumulative output in between each one of those reset commands. It's absolutely consistent, totally stable, and dependent on the speed of Oscillator 1. It's the thing that's cycling at, what's Oscillator 1 currently cycling at? If I turn it up, we can hear it at audio levels. Of course, I'm still playing a regular C, so 130 Hz is Oscillator 1's speed of disengage hard sync. Oscillator 2 is cycling at 195 Hz, 195 cycles every second. But that's not what's happening. What's actually happening is that 130 of these more complex shapes are being drawn every second, and that is translating into middle C in our ears. That's why Oscillator 1 is determining the pitch of the sound. All of that's very mathematically interesting, and it's fascinating to see it in an oscilloscope. But what it really means is that we get an interesting tonal effect, because Oscillator 2's pitch is now a tone control. Now, all of these modulation options can be engaged simultaneously, so we can have cross modulation, ring modulation, and hard sync all engaged together. One of the beauties of the Synthx, why it was such an unusual synthesizer, is because you've got such complex modulation options between these two oscillators, and it generates interesting sound. That's a single oscillator output in that sound. That's pretty impressive. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to click subscribe to be notified of the next episode. I'll see you then. Thanks very much for watching.